Andrew Williamson here. Welcome back to Williamson Education. Well, we're getting down once again into the nitty-gritty of an important topic in grammar. We looked most recently at the topic of parallelism, learning that parallelism is the grammatical rule governing items in lists and sentences. Today we're going to look at a specific application of the rules of parallelism, namely an application having to do with comparisons. Have you ever wanted to tell your brother or sister that you're better than they are at swimming? Ever want to tell your parents that you're smarter than they are? I'm sure you have, and in that case, you'll need to be using comparatives in your sentences. Let's dive in and look at how to use parallel structures in comparative sentences. As you might expect from the name, comparatives are sentence structures that involve placing two or more items side by side for, well, comparison. Generally speaking, you can tell you're dealing with a comparative sentence whenever you have a word ending in er followed shortly by the comparative word than. For example, she is taller than he is. Here we see the comparative word taller ending in er, followed by the word than, indicating that a comparison has been written into the sentence. Or take another example. We are better at skiing than they are. Notice we once again have a comparative word in the er word better, followed shortly by the word than. This is a comparison. The word better, as you may know, refers to something that is more good than another thing. But we don't say more good, we say better instead, and we say worse for something that is less good than another thing. In general, but not always, we add the suffix er to words that are one syllable long and sometimes to words that are two syllables in order to form the comparative. For adjectives that are more than two syllables long, we simply place the word more before the adjective when creating a comparison. For example, you will be more articulate than you were before. More articulate is a correctly formed comparative because the base adjective articulate has four syllables. We add the word more before it to form the comparative. Generally speaking, we use words with an er ending when comparing exactly two items, as in the example sentences that I've given up to this point. By contrast, we use words ending with an est when comparing three or more items. Words with the est endings like fastest, strongest, and latest are so-called superlatives. They indicate the best, worst, or otherwise most extreme items in a set. By the way, best and worst are also superlatives. All of this is the introduction to comparatives. But what does any of it have to do with parallelism? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson, comparative sentence structures are essentially lists of things. Consider the following example. Baseballs are harder than footballs. Here, I am listing two items in a comparison, baseballs and footballs. Specifically, I am listing them in order to compare them. But from a parallelism perspective, all that really matters is that I am listing items. In the comparative list I have created in this example sentence, everything is working well. How come? Because I have two items listed that are comparable to each other in the sense that they are both nouns. Baseballs is a noun, and footballs is a noun. But with comparisons, the rules of parallelism are even stricter than they usually are. It's not enough that the items are both nouns. They have to be comparable nouns. In this case, we can determine that the nouns are in fact comparable to each other because they are both kinds of balls used in sporting matches. It is logical to compare them to each other. As I have mentioned, the rules for parallel structures and comparisons are more restrictive than are the rules for normal parallel lists. In normal parallel lists, it's enough to have, say, three nouns lined up next to each other. In comparative structures, though, the nouns need to be the same type of thing. They need to fall, broadly speaking, into the same category as each other. What constitutes a comparable category? It's a bit difficult to say, but you will see what I mean better as we work on more comparisons in our next lesson. Comparisons can get more complicated when the structures they use involve several words. Consider this correct example of comparative structure. The woman was better at math than she was at poetry. This sentence is a bit more complicated than the first one. Here we are not comparing something so simple as two nouns. Instead, we are comparing the quality of goodness at two particular tasks. You will notice that the comparison involves a preposition, at. When a person is good, they are good at a specific thing. In order for the comparison to function properly, we need to repeat the structuring preposition at in the second half of the comparison, after the word than. You will notice something else about my example sentence. Not only did I repeat the structuring preposition at, but I also repeated the structuring clause she was. Often comparisons will involve phrases like prepositional phrases, but in other instances they will involve entire clauses, entire subject-verb constructions. You'll have to be really careful with these subject-verb constructions. Let me give you an example of what I mean. The example that I am about to give is not correct, but it will likely sound correct to most speakers of English. Here it is. I am shorter than him. Simple sentence. Sounds pretty correct, right? Well, believe it or not, this sentence is not correctly structured. There is an error in the parallelism of the comparison. How come? Everything comes down to the items of comparison. What are we comparing in this sentence? It might seem that we are comparing two people, the I mentioned at the beginning of the sentence and the him mentioned at the end. But this is not quite right. In fact, we are comparing how short I am to how short he is. That's how parallelism works in the sentence. We have to compare a clause to a clause. Remember our good old friends subject and object case pronouns? Well, I have misused the object case pronoun at the end of the sentence. The full correct version of the sentence should read as follows. I am shorter than he is. And if you want to make a slightly shorter sentence, you can also say, this sounds weird, I am shorter than he. Let's try another example of the same idea. Here's a second sentence with an error in the pronoun usage following the comparatives. The other team's players were slower than us. Can you spot the error here? What items are being compared? It might seem that the comparison involves a simple juxtaposition of the other team's players and us. In fact, the comparison is a little bit more complicated than that. Actually, we are comparing how slow the other team's players are to how slow we are. Notice that the pronoun at the end of the sentence is us, an object case pronoun. But that will not work when we are comparing two clauses, because we need a subject case pronoun to serve as the subject of the second clause. The full, correct version of the sentence should read, the other team's players were slower than we were. Or if you'd like a shorter version of the sentence, you could also say, and again, this sounds weird, the other team's players were slower than we. As you can see, comparative structures involve a number of different grammatical topics that we have studied so far. Parallelism, yes, but also pronoun case and clause structure, for example, not to mention the parts of speech themselves. That's why it may be helpful for you as you watch this lesson to go back and rewatch several of the earlier lessons on these several topics in order to understand parallelism in greater depth. As you rewatch these lessons, think forward and backward at the same time. Forward to what you will have learned in these later lessons, backward to the beginnings of our journey together on the Spread the Word campaign. We've come so far already, we still have a bit farther to go. In our next lesson, we will look at even more complicated parallel comparative structures and examine some of the techniques for overcoming common challenges. I'll see you right back here for our next and final lesson in this unit on parallel and comparative structures. Spread the word, my friends.